Futurized goes beneath the trends, tracking the underlying forces of disruption in tech, policy, business models, social dynamics, and the environment. Join me, futurist Trond Arne Undheim, PhD author, investor, and serial entrepreneur, as I discuss the societal impact of deep tech such as AI, blockchain, IoT, nanotech, quantum, robotics, and synthetic biology, and tackle topics such as entrepreneurship, trends, or the future of work. I'm a research scholar in global systemic risk, innovation, and policy at Stanford University. On Futurized, I interview smart people with a soul, founders, authors, executives, and other thought leaders, or even the occasional celebrity. Futurized is a bi-weekly show preparing you to think about how to deal with the next decade's disruption so you can succeed and thrive no matter what happens. Futurized, conversations that matter. If you're new to the show, seek particular topics, or are looking for a great way to tell your friends about the show, we've got the episode categories. Those are at futurized.org/episodes. I am the co-author of Augmented Lean, a human-centric framework for managing frontline operation, and the author of Health Tech, Rebooting Society's Software, Hardware, and Mindset, Future Tech, How to Capture Value from Disruptive Industry Trends, Pandemic Aftermath, How Coronavirus Changes Global Society, The Disruption Games, How to Thrive on Serial Failure, and of Leadership from Below, How the Internet Generation Redefines the Workplace. For an overview, you can go to trondundheim.com/books. At this stage, Futurized is lucky enough to have several sponsors, and to check them out, go to futurized.org/sponsors. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or to get an overview of other services provided by me, including how to book me for keynote speeches, please go to futurized.org/store. We'll consider all brands that have demonstrably positive contributions to the future. Before you do anything else, make sure you are subscribed to our newsletter on futurized.org, where you can find hundreds of episodes of conversations that matter to the future. Please also leave a positive review on iTunes. Thanks so much. Sofya, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, excited.
Yeah, so we met at the Existential Risk Conference at Stanford last year, and since then I have been following your work quite a bit here, and to see that you've been very active. Let's first maybe run up your background. So you have a bachelor from Berkeley in biology, and then you are now doing a doctorate in clinical medicine and cell biology at University of Oxford. But throughout your career, you've been very interested in biosecurity, sort of on the side, and you have a bunch of other things that will engagement that we'll talk about a little bit as well. Tell me, how did you get so interested in biology in the first place, Sofya?
Yeah, so I got really interested in biology because I wanted to know how muscles worked. So I think I was a teenager and I was fascinated about how does my body work. So I thought about, okay, this is how muscles work. This is like actin myosin. And then I wanted to keep going. So I went down to atoms and I tried to understand how atoms worked. And I just thought it was a fascinating puzzle. So then I worked my way all the way back up to biology, kind of like dabbling in physics a little bit. And I thought that the biological level of questions were the most interesting ones for me. So I always just had more questions of like, how does this part of the body function? How does this other thing happen? How does this mechanism work? And I think that it's kind of, stuck me or like ever since.
You and I had a little prep call, and I asked you some curious things about you. I mean, one thing is obviously that you have traveled a lot in your life. You have background from Russia. You've been living in the UK, which I think explains your British accent, somewhat British accent, and then you spent some years obviously at Berkeley in California, and now you're back in Britain for school again. But you said. You had some funny thing that you told me. You said there is another person who has your exact name. How does that work out? Do you have a doppelganger walking around?
Yeah, so there's another actress, and her name is Sofya Lebedeva, and then I pronounce my name Sofya, but it definitely gets very, it's spelled the same or like very similarly, and it gets quite confusing. And yeah, I've had somebody message me essentially being like on social media asking me when the next season of Tetris will be out, and I had to regretfully inform them that I had no idea, and I'm also not them, or I'm not the person they thought I was. So yeah, it's a
Yeah, the internet is funny that way. They think they're right because they've seen it on the internet. So you, as being a pretty authoritative source on who you are, yeah, sometimes you come out short. That's funny. So at the Paul Klennerman lab there, you are doing basic immunology. So you're down bench science. You're deep into a very, very exciting area of science. Tell us a little bit about immunology for a second.
Yeah, so the lab that I'm part of studies mate cells. So there's a mucosal invariant associated T cells. So there's a subtype of T cell, which is a kind of helper cell or one of the cells that's involved in the immune response. And in general, I guess the reason why immunology fascinates me is because I had a lot of general courses in my undergraduate, and the immunology course was just the most confusing. I went away from that just having more questions than answers. And it just really feels like every time I study like a viral response or anything to do with other areas of biology, things kind of just keep coming back to the immune system. So it has really cool links with like your nutrition, your brain, and just there's so many links that we haven't even thought of. And I think it's just a really exciting field that has a lot of intersections and is really fascinating from a personal perspective for me, just because I think it's intellectually interesting, but then I also think it has a lot of, positive impact or a lot of like potential for impact. So that's why I'm trying to.
Yeah, so let's get to the impact because I guess that's how our conversation started initially. But you are, and we're going to be talking about biorisk and I guess biorisk activism in the positive sense, because there's also a kind of an aggressive biorisk activism, people, running into farms and stuff. I think I want you to define a little bit how you got involved in biorisk activities and what those activities entail. But why don't we start with this wonderful article you just wrote? Um, why don't we just go ahead to say, if someone is interested, a young person perhaps interested in biosecurity, you wrote this article called On Ramps into Biosecurity, and I guess it explains a little bit your journey into it as well. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about what that entails?
Yeah. So I think what I'll start with first is defining what I understand biosecurity to be, and that might be different from others. So to me, biosecurity is the preparedness or preparing to and like reducing risk or reducing harm from biotechnologies. So that can be pandemics. So it doesn't have to be a technology, but it can be a misuse of a technology, or biological agents such as kind of like biochemical weapons and things like that. So it's how prepared is a nation state or a country or even the whole world against some of these threats from these emerging technologies. In terms of how I got involved into biosecurity, I think that I saw a lot of the traditional career paths that were available to me during kind of my earlier degrees, and what those looked like was being a doctor, being a professor, working in biotech industry. And none of those sounded that interesting to me. So I thought, how can I think about or like try to do a different career path or try to do something different? How can I actually help people? And that's a question that I still definitely really struggle with. So I don't have all the answers. But that was kind of the main thing that I went through. And in terms of the on ramps posts, so the article that I wrote outlined kind of my vision for what getting involved in biosecurity looks like. So first, you kind of hear about it. You hear that maybe reducing the like risk of pandemics or reducing the damage done by pandemics is a good idea. Then you kind of learn a bit more about it. So I did some reading. There was kind of a few reading lists floating about. I talked to a few experts, but I really didn't see myself working on this full time. It was just something that I was quite interested in. And then there's kind of like this weird chasm or kind of like gap in between where you kind of sort of mill about and then you sort of emerge in full-time work. But what the gap was filled in for me was doing projects. So it was really working with other students, working with other professionals, and thinking, okay, is there an article that I can write? Is there some sort of organization I can help out? So I got involved in the Bioautomation Challenge based in the Crick Institute in London. And what they're doing is essentially helping automate or helping develop scripts that you can automate wet lab research. So instead of me sitting at the bench and pipetting for 12 hours, you have a robot that does it for you. Naturally, with any sort of automation, there's a lot of downsides. So increasing the speed at which something gets done can also increase the risk. So just because you're putting information out there, all these protocols out there in an open source format, they can have some sort of risks. So I was really curious about thinking through the risks of this and thinking about how can we mitigate this? How can we really ensure that we do, like, if we do share these protocols, they're shared safely? How do we ensure different levels of access? So that was kind of my first go at kind of a more professional level like project within biosecurity. And then from that, it's kind of the classic stepping stone thing. As soon as I did one thing, other people kind of asked me to get more involved, and then it was just kind of getting more connected in the space.
Yeah, I mean the article is fascinating because it's you've supplied all the links necessary, so it's like hear about it, and then you tell people where you can hear about it in a loose and sort of easy way with like shorter blog posts, and then learn about it. The articles and organizations get more serious and more deeper and perhaps even academically inclined in labs and such, and government entities and stuff, and more like certification type things, and then project work you said, and then obviously the full-time option of getting involved. You and I initially met when we were discussing your article that you submitted and presented at Stanford last year on the success criteria for what you call dual use biosecurity education. Can you tell us a little bit about what you wrote about? So there were, I recall, a bunch of different initiatives, and these are initiatives, I believe, mostly for professionals, but there was one exception there that is more like a competition style thing. But what are the available courses if you actually are at the level that you're perhaps a young scientist and you want to get even more involved in biosecurity education? What is available for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll outline. So in my article, the kind of like curiosity that started for me was that after I'd gotten more involved in biosecurity, I was kind of started thinking back to when I was first getting involved, and I was wondering what is a pathway or what is a way for someone to get involved in biosecurity. So I wanted to do a brief survey or a brief kind of like look into what courses were available. So there were a number of different courses that were available. So there was a Vienna course by the University of Vienna in Austria. There was a Local People Make Sense framework. It didn't really have an affiliation. It was more of an educational framework. There was also a number of courses by the University of Bradford in the UK. There was a course by the National Defense Medical College in Japan. There's also so there are a number of them that were kind of like university associated. There's another course by the Karolinska Institute. So I think a lot of the courses that I found during my initial search were kind of courses that were integrated into parts of the medical degrees or kind of like biology degrees. So it was either graduate students or undergraduate students, and they had the courses as part of their coursework. The thing that I found, or the thing that I think is actually more accessible, or kind of something that I'm more excited about, is the Blue Dot Biosecurity Pandemic Preparedness course. So that has actually launched since the article has been written, and I've also like had a brief look at the syllabus and essentially like helped to pick out some of the readings for that. So it was really, really exciting. That's a course that I'm like very excited about, and I would love for more people to do it. So I think if you're a new person interested in mitigating the damage, like, or kind of like mitigating like threats from pandemics, I would say the Blue Dot biosecurity course is the one to go for you. And the article itself, there was kind of a lot of trends that kind of emerged from the different courses. So if the course has the right context, if the course has the right length, and it has the right personal connection, that's really when the course works well. So if you have no biological background and you get thrown into a course that has quite specific and advanced biology, naturally the kind of like intended effect is just that you don't really take much away from it. Likewise, if you don't have that much of a background in risk and you get thrown into a course that has a ton of like risk, there's just like too much risk or like assumes too much knowledge, again, you will feel quite lost. So that's why I think of all the courses, I would say Blue Dot's Biosecurity Fundamentals course has the right balance between context that's needed for biology, context that's needed for risk, and it really just assumes some background, but not too much background in either end. And is also very engaging, and you get to go in a group of students and learn about these concepts.
Sofya, when you speak about risk and biorisk
Yeah.
and biosecurity, you are so excited about it. Why is it that most of us, I don't know, I maybe just admit my own bias. I mean, I'm very excited about it too, but when I'm exposed to it, unfortunately, in a university context, it is because it's an obligation. So there's also that negative thing, the sort of straitjacket that, oh, you have to take this course, you have to ask this permission. So for many people, including leading researchers, it becomes a chore. Biosecurity also, obviously, it has, you're motivated to do it, but in the everyday, it can become a little tedious thing that you just have to do to check the boxes because no one walks around thinking that they are a risk to human nature, that everyone's doing their research, they're going about with their thing. How do you transmit this excitement to the people who need it, the people who are doing dangerous research, obviously trying to save humanity, but, that has risks?
Yeah, I think
Yeah, I think
there's a number of
there's a number.
communication, oh, I guess a number of different ways to look at risks and like my excitement about risk, because I also want to be upfront and say that I'm not always excited about risks in terms of when I have that form that I need to sign, or like yet another like kind of bureaucratic hurdle that I inevitably come up with when I'm doing my lab work. It is frustrating, but I also think that it's important to recognize that the reason those mechanisms are in place is because like it's for, I guess it's just learning to kind of like step away from the ego for a little bit and like remember that those things are done because the thing like the safeguards are there in place to help protect humanity as opposed to just you, and your small annoyance for you could actually have huge upsides for the rest of humanity. So I think that really thinking about it from that perspective helps me stay motivated. In terms of communicating about risk and like thinking about why it's important, I just think that like life is pretty amazing, so I would like to, I guess, keep it that way, or at least like humans being alive is something that I enjoy, and it's quite basic, but I think that like trying to make sure that you remember or keep in perspective that like some of these things can have disastrous consequences, and yeah, trying to mitigate them is kind of how I think about it.
Can you lead us into a tiny bit of an understanding of what dual use really refers to in biosecurity? Because let me just, at like a surface level, point out that dual use sort of implies that there's at least two types of use. And I guess the original thinking was that there is a bad and a good use. That's at the very, very basic level. But how does that term, why is that term important, and why do you use it?
Yeah, I think that so dual use to me is something that is a piece of research that can have positive consequences and also negative consequences. So if we think about just advancing knowledge, there can be knowledge advances that can be useful, and then there can also be knowledge advances that can harm society. So it's kind of like the more people have this knowledge, it can actually be a harm to them as opposed to an aid. So the way that I think about dual use, or the way that I kind of like justify it to myself, or like think really address the issue, is really thinking about do the benefits outweigh the risks. And there's a lot of much more qualified people that do this for a living, and they assess different types of research. Essentially, when a new piece of research or a new research program gets submitted, there's kind of a review board that reviews it and thinks, okay, will the benefits of learning these things about bacteria or viruses or fungi or anything else like that we're studying, will the new knowledge gained from these studies be beneficial to society, or will it be harmful? And then there's also, if you do this research, there's also the second kind of like mechanism where you can do the research and you can find out about it, but then there's also how you publish it. So not everything that you research necessarily should be shared fully. While I'm a huge proponent of open access science, and I will die on this hill, I think that it's really, really important to share your work and communicate your findings. I think that there's certain ways in which you can communicate your findings that will have more benefits than risks. So in the more sensitive topics, I think more thought can be put into the publishing on these topics.
That's interesting. I mean, are you actually saying that the immunology community or people working on I guess, really serious biorisk, and with formulas or approaches and methods that could easily be misused, that they should publish in some sort of closed quarters or even just kind of share it between themselves. Is that even happening at some way? I mean, this sounds like something that military researchers do, but no one else does.
Yeah, I think currently there's a lot of, I think a lot of the research is, I think depends on what you define as close quarters. For example, the papers that I read are open access and they're open to everyone. Or some of the papers that I read are unfortunately only university access, so that limits it to people with a university login. The thing is, there's also, it really depends. There's also like very niche circles. So it's kind of like, I doubt, people are reading the same niche papers that I'm reading over breakfast, just because I'm not sure I would read that kind of stuff for fun, if I wasn't in this field. But I think that currently, from my understanding, there is no close quarter publishing. It really is, you make a research finding and then you publish it as you have it. However, I do think that there's maybe room for like figuring out the types of methods that you publish, or like so you're required to publish your methods with certain types of research, or like, and I think that there could be more thought that is done in terms of how the different methods get published and for certain types of dual use research. Because I want to clarify that nowhere near, or like a lot of immunology research is really just, I would consider it as net positive, and it doesn't really have a dual use, but there are some aspects of it that do have a dual use aspects, and those are the ones that could be more regulated. But then obviously the hard part is really, how do you define which of those aspects are the ones that should be regulated, and how do you do it? Because there will naturally be an uproar, and I would also be in disagreement if we regulated all of it.
I'm going to ask you to give two pitches. One is a pitch to the young scientists that should be more involved in biosecurity. What's the upside there? Let's say two cases. I guess one, someone studying biology, whether you're in high school or you're in college, why would they be involved in biosecurity more than what they have to?
Yeah. I think that the pitch is quite simple, and it's because it's really, really cool. I think that that's the short answer. I think it's just fascinating. And I think it's really exciting knowing that the research that you're doing is actually going to have an impact in the world, or is actually going to affect millions, if not billions of people. Because if you are able to, we've all been through COVID. So I think working on something along the lines of viral work or coronaviruses, or, other emerging viral work, I think it could be really, really interesting. But the beauty of biosecurity is that it's actually not just thinking about viruses. There's a ton of other things that need to happen. So biosecurity is really, really broad, and that's why it's really exciting. If you're a physicist, if you're a mechanical engineer, if you're a material scientist, if you code, if you paint, I think there's definitely, like, if you write blogs, like, there's so much room for involvement in this field, and we need people to communicate about it. So it's not just wet lab bench research, like the type of stuff that I do. We need people who are thinking about ultraviolet, ultra-germicidal radiation. We need people who are thinking about personal protective equipment stockpiling. We need people who are thinking about policy. We need people who are communicating about these risks. There's a huge range of ways to get involved. And there's kind of a biosecurity map that I reference in one of my articles that I think gives you a nice sense of just how broad this field is. And I think that that's really my pitch, is just, it's really, really cool. And there's something for you or something for everyone, regardless of your.
You actually answered my second question, because I was going to say, well, here's this other person who doesn't really know that much about bio, but has gotten worried and wants to see if they can contribute. But do you think that there are ways to get involved with policy and like slowly learn? Is the community, would you say the bio community, pretty inclusive? Like you can kind of join there and say, hey, I think I'm up on most issues, but this is new to me. Are you going to get embraced by people who care about biosecurity?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So to answer your first question is, yes, there's definitely room for you to get involved, or you as in, anyone that's listening right now. I think that we are always looking for people to communicate ideas effectively. We're looking for people to think about policy solutions. Something that I'm personally excited about is the translation of expertise from other fields into biosecurity, just because I think there's so many issues, or for example, public health or global health, or like access to medicines. There's so many things and learnings that we have from other sectors that we can translate into biosecurity. same with like nuclear risk and things like that. So there's a ton of transferable skills from those areas. And then also, if you don't have any background in anything in terms of risks, I think that it's just really the thing I would always suggest to people is just read about it, kind of see what's interesting to you, see where your curiosity takes you. And if it's not necessarily biosecurity, that is totally fine. It's really just follow your curiosity and your passion and see where it's interesting to you, because I think you will know better than any advice that I can give. And then in terms of the second question, or kind of like the third question of will the biosecurity community be accepting, I will go with yes. In an intro level, people are definitely interested in having new people in the field. That's why we have the Oxford Biosecurity Group. We're really, really especially excited about young people and like early career people in the early career stages to join and like try new projects. I will point out that like if you are completely new to the field and you go and write something and you try to kind of, propose solutions without really having checked with a few people beforehand, people might not be as keen to listen to you, just because biology can be quite complicated. So if you kind of give broad solutions without really having gone into the nitty-gritty parts of it, and if you don't have that context, some of the solutions might seem like they work, but they just might not really stand up to the test. So I think that just being a bit cautious about maybe putting out work publicly in the initial stages, that would be my a word of caution. But I definitely think the community is very welcoming and very open to new people getting involved in the field and kind of like bringing new ideas. Yeah.
Fascinating. Sofya, you are just in the middle of your career, I guess, also in learning. You just started a PhD program. Do you have any idea what you want to apply this knowledge to? So you're doing bench science right now and doing risk work on the side, and getting very engaged with this educational approach. Where do you think that leads for you? Have you thought about commercializing this yourself, or I think you were involved in some on some level there as well, or do you think that your role is going to be more back in the science?
Yeah, I think that the thing that I have a passion for is uplifting people, creating communities, and then also working in really like trying to creating solutions in places where there have not been solutions before. So I think a job that combines those elements would be somewhere that I would be happy. And because of that broad description, I think that there's a number of places that I would be quite happy in. So I have been doing some policy work recently with my work with ARMA. So that's more to do with antimicrobial resistance. So I would consider it as a risk, so a biosecurity risk, but I wouldn't necessarily consider it a like global catastrophic risk. There's kind of debate among members of the community on that particular topic. And I've really enjoyed my policy work, and I've really enjoyed working with policymakers and thinking about how do we actually get people to have access to antimicrobials? How do we really change the economic landscape? How do we think about like the interplay between the social and the economical and the political kind of like factors, and like which is the right lever to push, which is the right space, which is the right country? There's a lot of really interesting questions that come up with that. So I think that thinking about how do we mitigate global catastrophic biological risks from a policy perspective, I think would be a space that I would be quite happy in after my education. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that is a space where there are few voices, right? Currently, there's all kinds of calls, including from the Sendai framework, the disaster framework for the UN. Everyone talks about synthetic biology or some sort of biorisk, and it generally is understood that this is obviously because the technology is so emergent, because the frameworks aren't in place, then the talent is also not in place to, like you pointed out, to talk about it and to say something or even suggest something useful. So let's maybe round off a little bit about talking about the future developments that are possible in this space. I know you just finished a world building course, but what on earth is world building?
Yeah. So another thing that I enjoy doing in my spare time is thinking about how do I want the world to look like in 10, 20, 30, 40 years? That's kind of the timescales that I think about. And the other questions that I ask myself is what technologies will there be present? What government systems will there be present? What is a good government system? So I really like thinking about the big picture questions and taking the time to really like work with others and like essentially interact with people in different fields to mine and try to tackle some of these questions, because I think that the natural thing that comes up for me, maybe to come back to the metaphor, like the thing I talked about in the beginning, I went from biology, I went all the way down to atoms, I went back to biology. But to me, the thing that really matters is the kind of one step above biology, which is the social and the kind of like social aspect of it. So it doesn't really matter if you make a cool vaccine, if people don't take it, it won't have the positive effect intended. So there's so much that's really, really important, is figuring out what is a good social framework, or I guess at least a not as bad social framework or government structure compared to some of the structures that we currently have. And so world building for me has been really thinking about what do I want a world to look like, and the course specifically helped us create a world in a world vision for 2045. And we talked about how advances in AI, how advances in biotechnology, how advances in kind of the energy sector, how they will affect and change the world and what that will look like. So that's been something I've been thinking about.
All right, can you give us a peek into that? Let's just start with the next decade. What's going to happen to the biospace and I guess the overall biorisk environment, in the next decade? Are we looking at sort of breakthroughs in immunology, breakthroughs in vaccine platforms? We already know that the mRNA platform is still young and potentially could be applied to other vaccines and potentially game changing. Are there other things that you are excited about, worried about, that you think both is interesting from an innovation perspective, but also needs to be managed well, not to go awry or be misused?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in the next decade, there will be a lot of development. So the natural first thing I'm going to say is AI has been transforming the way biology is done, and I think it will continue to do that. And the natural thing is I think that there will also be places where it's transformative that I can't even see yet. And that's the thing that I'm most excited about, is really kind of like artificial intelligence improving research in areas that like we can't even like think of yet or imagine. But in general, with artificial intelligence, kind of like the computational power is increasing. We're able to look at more protein structures. We're able to really understand how things function and spend a lot more time kind of modeling something instead of testing it in the lab. I do think currently we still do need to keep testing things physically in the lab, but that's kind of an ever-evolving stage. So in terms of breakthroughs that I'm thinking about, I think personalized medicine is already a huge field, but it will continue evolving. There's a lot of large cohort studies that are currently getting analyzed. And I think that the trends that we can elucidate from those large cohort studies, so anything that like the new discoveries that come out from those, I think will be instrumental, because I think that that's really where the power of kind of like big analyses and like really interesting conclusions will emerge. Then maybe we'll find specific gene fragments that are indicative of particular diseases or anything, or we'll find other correlations that we hadn't yet seen. And I think that the really exciting discoveries will be made from like just using data we already have and finding new and exciting conclusions from that. So that's something I'm really excited about.
May I ask you, I mean, we haven't talked about this before, but I mean, I recently wrote a paper on the intersection of risk and AI and synthetic biology. And in thinking about that paper, first of all, I am not a synthetic biologist myself, and I'm certainly also not an AI programmer, but I have worked, at the intersection of those fields still, and there is a lot to say there. How do you personally feel about the fact that you already are becoming more and more of an expert at the bench science, and that's hard enough. That's actually, it's the forefront of a scientific field. It's really hard. And then on the side, you are an expert on risk issues, or you're, really exploring that. This third area of AI, which obviously is one of the platforms that is going to change synthetic biology. How on planet Earth are you able to focus on all of those areas, and or are you? I mean, are you thinking that AI is something that is going to be, there's always going to be someone in your team who's a super expert in AI, or are you taking it deeply seriously as this is something you are going to be an expert on?
Currently, that is not a priority at the moment. So currently the thing that I'm most lacking in is the fundamental science and the fundamental knowledge. So that's the kind of the key gap that I've identified, and I'm working quite heavily on fixing that. just because the learning curve in my PhD has been incredibly steep. So I would say that kind of artificial intelligence has not been a focus of my own personal work. In terms of how teams will be structured and in terms of how I'm thinking about it in the future, I think if you're thinking about being I think people who have technical expertise in both will naturally end up doing better. That's the simple answer. It's unfortunate. It's very difficult to have both the technical expertise in biology and in artificial intelligence. But I do think that is a very, very kind of like lucrative set of skills that I think will allow people to kind of like develop a lot of potential. In terms of risk, like technical lab work and artificial intelligence, in my opinion, I think that's too broad. I think it's good to have an awareness of all three, but I don't think having technical expertise on all three, at that point, you're kind of starting to spread yourself too thin. So I would maybe pick two subfields, or, one of the three and get really, really good at one. And then only after you get really, really good at one, transition into two or three or more.
Yeah, I'm asking because, bioinformatics, at least that was the old term. I guess it's a specialty that kind of shows up at the intersection of these two fields. But even that field historically, it's a complicated field because, whether you come from the IT side or from the bio side, and, I know people who have come from either side and are trying to, make a dent in bioinformatics or now, I guess, AI, bio, methods. It's really it's a tricky situation. So I just love how humble you are, trying to fix your knowledge gaps. I mean, I think Oxford should be a pretty good place for it. So you must be in the right place. Maybe just to round everything off, let me ask this long-term question. So you said world building 2045. If we look that far ahead, so now we're more like 20 plus years ahead, what what do you see then? So presumably AI will be a very mature technology by then, and synthetic biology perhaps will have come of age. Um, Biomanufacturing and other things, certainly something will have happened. Where do you think we will be?
Yeah, something that, so in terms of, I think we will be, definitely agree with you that like AI will be quite a mature technology by that point. I think that there is a wide field of possibilities in terms of where it could go. But something that I think that is definitely going to be crucial, I think, is at least the positive world that I imagine is someone where you're able to wake up and have a day full of creativity. So where you're able to work on projects, community interactions, and kind of like large scale, big picture like questions with members of your community. So I picture a world in which there will be a lot of local action and kind of like a bottom up approach in terms of like community government, community interaction. People are very, very actively participating in AI facilitated voting systems. Then people are also very actively participating in their own personal development or their own personal life. So there's a lot of personal choice that's available. I think that a natural downside that comes up is the increase in inequality. So I do think that unfortunately, I am currently struggling to see in a world in which we will have decreased inequality in some ways. I think there will still be huge inequality gaps in the next 20 odd years. I really hope I'm wrong. That would be incredible, but that's currently the pessimistic vision that I have. I think the other things that would be really, really interesting in terms of like, so synthetic biology or just biology in general, again, hopefully in a few decades, I will be able to know at 18, once I've reached an age in which I can get my DNA sequence and receive the results and have that choice. I will be able to know which diseases I'm predisposed to. I will be able to have specific nutritional recommendations for things that I can do in order to reduce my risk of said diseases. I will also have a clear understanding, or I will have a way to measure my biological markers and track those. And essentially, instead of treating diseases once they come up, we will be able to prevent diseases or reduce the threat of a lot of the diseases or health ailments that we have. And then to talk on the biorisk side, when, not if, but when a new pathogen emerges, we will be able to respond as a society quickly, efficiently, and with a pretty like robust and precise response, whether that's an antiviral, whether that's an antibacterial, whether that's a global vaccine. It really depends as to what it is. Hopefully we'll have large scale vaccine platforms, which will basically be like Lego blocks. So we'll have a giant box full of Lego blocks, and when a new pathogen comes on or comes into the world, we'll be able to just Lego block a vaccine together rather than starting from scratch and just thinking about how do we even build it from the beginning. So that's kind of one of the
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I just saw a blog post this week from my former colleague Nuvar Afiyan, who is one of the co-founders of Moderna, and he was lamenting a bit in this blog post. And despite all of the advances that have happened around COVID, and he obviously was both a contributor there and a beneficiary of some government support to sort of get their vaccine and vaccine platform out in the open and spread around. But despite all of these advances, he was sort of painting the picture that they could go two directions. Go, we did that. Everybody in government thinks we solved all the problems, but or we could say we haven't actually solved all the problems. We lucked out, and we had, we could pull something out of a hat because Moderna happened to have worked on it for 10 years. It's not obvious, is it, that we all have learned a lesson, or that governments have learned a lesson from COVID? I mean, would you say it's like a 50-50 chance that we will be more prepared next time, or would you say it's a greater chance than that? Are you optimistic that when you say this new pathogen emerges, whether it's zoonotic or from where it comes, it will be dealt with?
I think it's really hard to say. And the reason why is because it really depends on the type of pathogen. And it also really depends on how quickly it spreads. Because if it is another kind of coronavirus, I think we would be quite well equipped. But if it's a completely new virus, or if it's a bacterial pathogen or anything else like that, I just think that we will not be prepared. So I really do think it depends as to, I guess, what the nature of the beast will be. And then also in terms of the other thing that I'm possibly skeptical of is, unfortunately, some governments, I believe, have gotten complacent in the sense that they thought that the COVID response was apt, or I guess adequate. Whereas I think a lot, in my opinion, probably a lot of other people possibly listening to this, there was definitely a lot of flaws in at least a lot of the countries that I lived in across COVID.
Well, and lastly, to sort of concur with you there, there is also, I mean, I was one of the people who had a much more catastrophic set of scenarios in mind, because I was looking at the traditional way that governments, deal with vaccines, which is a cautious approach, contrary to what some people would claim, and it's usually a 10 plus year march to get any vaccines approved. This was, all happened via emergency use authorization, or at least the initial vaccines. And and who's to say that A, we would do that again? Two, what if we do that and it turns out it's a completely spectacular vaccine that goes very wrong? We have also seen with COVID how much destruction can be brought when people wrongly or rightly assume that that a vaccine is let out there for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I definitely think that's so that's, I think, actually kind of brings me back to the same point where it's really who we need is everyone, as opposed to just wet lab scientists. Because the communication piece about new vaccine, the communication piece, the policy, the kind of economic analysis on all of these different things, that's really where the gaps are. And then also distribution, logistics, so many other areas and sectors. If we can't get the vaccine to the people, if we can't convince the people to take the vaccine, if we if we can't convince people to stay indoors or do whatever other precaution that we need, that's really where our response will fail. And it's not necessarily the basic science that's going to be the blocker. So I definitely think that there's so much room for a lot of other people and a lot of other disciplines in biosecurity.
Well, Sofya, this has been fascinating. I thank you so much for sharing some of these perspectives, and what an inspiring path that you're on. And I really hope that some others will be inspired too, and choose a path that goes towards more insight and more knowledge, and I guess more action, because they all, like you said, they go together, and it's a social and scientific game here that we're playing. and more people should be involved. So thanks a lot, Sofya. I hope I can call on you again for some and to see where you are over the next few years.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a pleasure.
Great. You have just listened to another episode of the Futurized podcast with me, Trond Arne Undheim, futurist, scholar, and author. If you are interested in my products or services, feel free to check out futurized.org/store, where you can book a keynote speech, become a sponsor or partner, request a podcast swap, or buy a few of my books, such as Augmented Lean, Health Tech, Future Tech, Pandemic Aftermath, Disruption Games, or Leadership from Below. If you're interested in any or all of my projects, check out my website, trondundheim.com, which has links to other podcasts as well as my public appearances. Thank you. Please share this show with those you care about. To find us on social media is easy. We are Futurized on LinkedIn and YouTube, and Futurized 2 on Instagram and Twitter. See you next time. Futurized, conversations that matter.